intensity of human contact with these stressors. We can do this through explicit measurements or models, and we're specifically thinking about most of the time about human exposure assessment, but you can also think about this for animals, of course. So, and then when we think about looking at the human health impact, how do we calculate what is the future rate of health impacts? So in order to calculate that, we need to know what the baseline health status is of the population. And we do that by consulting different sources of public health data that's available. And then that's a factor of that baseline health status times the expected change in exposure. And again, that comes more from the climate modeling side of things and exposure studies. And then ultimately you need to know what the exposure response relationship is. So that's where epidemiology comes into play, to understand what is the relationship between these exposures and these responses. And so some common epidemiological study designs that are used in the climate and health field, we can think about time contrasts, where we're comparing different environmental exposures and health outcomes at different points of time in people from the same area. Or we can look across space and look across different areas, how environmental exposures change and how health outcomes change. So just as an example of a time contrast example, this is a great study that came out of Peru, where they looked at the effects of El Nino, and El Nino there was an extreme El Nino event in Peru, and they looked at how and it had a big effect on ambient temperature in Peru. So they looked over a long time period at hospital admissions for diarrheal diseases for kids in Lima, Peru. And so they have all the historical data, and they could show, like, here's the relationship, what it was like in the pre-El Nino conditions. And then during El Nino, there's a much stronger relationship. So then they're able to contrast those two time periods and come up with an estimate of what the effect of temperature was on the diarrheal disease admissions. And then this is an example of a space contrast where you have across all of the Pacific Islands. On the x-axis, you have the average annual temperature for that location. And then the y-axis is just the prevalence of diarrhea in that population. And so there was this kind of, they reported on how there was this linear relationship between the average annual temperature and diarrhea rates.
I think the slides are not progressing.
Ah, dear. Okay, so Luann, will you share the slides?
So now you just
now it is.
Now it is. Oh. They progressed. So now we're seeing the Cook Island, the average temperature versus diarrheal.
Okay. So let me just keep going and let me know if they don't progress. Did it just progress or no?
Yeah, that's sub-Saharan diarrhea in sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay, so just stop me again if it stops working.
Okay.
So here we have an example of how, taking this equation, thinking about how this plays out. If you have, this was just an example from data that was not totally up to date, but if you have in sub-Saharan Africa, you have a very high number of a high burden of diarrheal diseases. So 430,000 deaths per year. And then let's say you have a 1 degree Celsius increase, and that's your expected change in exposure. And that's associated with an 8% through these epidemiological models. It's an estimated 8% increase in diarrhea for a 1 degree Celsius increase. So you can kind of look at that and think, is 8% a lot or a little? But when you're multiplying it by a very high baseline health status, a high baseline prevalence, you actually get a pretty high impact. So multiplying a big number by a small number still gives you a very big number. So that's where we get into these questions about understanding what the baseline health status is, and that being very important in determining the impacts of climate change. That's going forward. Great. That's helpful, Gordon. When we think about these relationships, we often think about, okay, well, what are the climate drivers? How does that affect the exposure pathways? How does that affect health outcomes? But it's also really important to think about this all occurring within the context that it occurs in. So we have non-climate stressors also at play, land use change, ecosystem degradation, et cetera. And then we also have all of the social determinants, which often are even more important than the exposure pathways themselves. So I'll talk about that a little bit more. So when we think about vulnerability and social vulnerability, we have to take into account not just the exposure, like the actual climate impacts of extreme precipitation, temperature, whatever it is, but we also have to think about the sensitivity of the system. So that's the degree to which the system is actually affected or modified by the exposure. So things that you can measure would be things like infrastructure, housing conditions, demographics, and then also the adaptive capacity of the system. So that's the ability of the system to reduce its sensitivity and cope with or respond to the changes. And sometimes those can be a little bit more fuzzy, things like social capital, governance, education level of the society. So it really kind of gets at, incorporating this gets into this, a notion that, you know, not all communities experience climate stressors the same way, and you could have the same sort of the same like strength of a hurricane, say, and it's going to have a very different impact on different communities depending on their ability to cope and respond to that stressor. So now thinking specifically about diarrheal diseases and climate. So first of all, just for those of you who don't know, that diarrhea is still responsible for a really unacceptably high toll globally, and is one of the top leading killers of children worldwide. And the deaths from diarrhea are not distributed equally across the globe. So you see in South Asia and Africa, the rates are much higher. So this is this world mapper that sizes countries based on the rates of different variables. It's fun to go on there and play with it if you've never seen them. So again, thinking back to this question about exposure and exposure pathways for diarrheal diseases, this can get really complicated because, and this is from a figure, I really like the way that these authors put this together, where they're talking about waterborne diseases and how to measure exposure. So, starting with, you have these dynamics of the pathogen itself within the reservoir. So in a body of water, that can be very changing over time. It can clump in space, so it can be kind of hard to detect. And then you have also there's temporal dynamics in terms of when people come into contact with those exposures and those pathogens. So those behaviors change at different times of the year, for example, recreation or what kind of sources of water people are using. And then you also have just different temporal dynamics in the host. So people are differentially vulnerable to disease at different times of the year, for example, or different densities of the population. And then there's also all of the different temporal infection dynamics that affect how people respond to the disease. And then there's we're always talking about sort of the tip of the iceberg when we're thinking about what actually gets reported and how, and when people go and seek healthcare and who's seeking healthcare. So there's all these different things. We think of it like, okay, exposure is you just measure that, but it's actually very complicated and can be highly variable. So there's a whole, there's fields of study dedicated to all of these different aspects. And then also complicating matters further, diarrhea isn't one single illness. There are multiple different agents of diarrhea that span multiple different taxa. And each of those has different characteristics, different infectious doses, incubation periods, shedding rates and durations. And importantly for this topic, they all survive a little bit differently in the environment. So that was the exposure pathways complications. Now let's think about the human health impact and how do we get to these exposure response relationships. So when I first got into this field and started getting into this, this was kind of the one paper that was out there on the burden of disease from climate change. And there was exactly one paragraph on diarrheal diseases, even though people often talk about climate change and waterborne diseases. And they had this one sentence really struck me because they said, okay, the dose response relationships were derived from time series studies of temperature variations in diarrhea in developing countries. That's great. That happens to be those two studies that I showed you earlier. And that was it. They weren't review studies. They were just, those were the two studies. And so you're taking two studies, one from Peru, one from the Pacific Islands, and that's your dose response relationship for the whole globe. So you have these two, two studies that are supposed to represent the whole globe. Thank you, Gordon. And then a few years later, this paper came out, and so there's a few more. There's a few more estimates. So we have 5. Again, 2 of them in Peru, one's in Japan, where the burden is not so high, and we have Bangladesh and Pacific Islands. So it's a little bit better, but not much better. And so their conclusion of that paper very appropriately was that there are these very large uncertainties with these future projections of diarrhea with climate change. And that's mostly because of this lack of climate health data. So it's kind of like, okay, it's actually on the epidemiologists that we're not doing a good enough job to characterize these functions. And so then that set me into a whole bunch of studies that basically set me down a road of looking for more data. And so we've done a series of multiple different systematic reviews of the literature where we're looking at associations between diarrheal diseases and these different weather exposures and stressors. And here's a couple of the main papers that have come out from this work. And so we looked at all the papers that looked at quantitative associations between these different variables. The first thing to note is there's a lot more papers on temperature than there are of these other exposures. Across the temperature papers, they're mostly positive associations. So increases in temperature are associated with increases in diarrhea. And so this is what's called a forest plot, where each row here is a different study. And this line here is the line of unity. So this would be no effect. And over to the right, all of these papers are showing a positive association between temperature and diarrhea. And these ones are showing a negative correlation. And that the main factor here is that these are all the viral pathogens, and these are the bacterial and all cause. And so viruses tend to peak at cooler, drier times of the year, and bacterial pathogens tend to increase with increasing temperatures. So now we've worked to increase the representation of where these studies are coming from across the globe. So that's for temperature. Rainfall is a lot more complicated. It gets into a lot of issues of, when you have different rainfall, if you have heavy rainfall, there are conditions that can lead to spread of pathogens. And then you also have similar factors, or not similar factors, but you can also, under dry conditions, you can also get to increased pathogen spread and disease. And so this is from another paper with just a more complicated version of the previous slide, but it kind of gets at this. It's just a lot more complicated than temperature. And one of the things that we've looked into a lot in my group is this idea of this first flush event, that when things have been dry, can be an accumulation of pathogens in the environment, and then a rainfall comes down, it can spread it around. versus when it's been, so there's this kind of idea that the antecedent conditions before rainfall occurs are really important to take into account. And so we just published a meta-analysis and systematic review on this that basically we've called it the concentration dilution hypothesis. And overall, across multiple different papers, we're seeing this effect in the literature. So just wanted to conclude with just a couple comments on adaptation and how do we want to think about adaptation given these relationships between climate stressors and diarrheal diseases. There's a lot of kind of, okay, climate's changing, like the sea levels coming up, what are the things we should do that are very sort of reactive to like the physical changes in the environment? Like, do we build houses on stilts and create raised tube wells so that you can address the issues of rising sea level, for example, or flooding. But I like to talk about how just your basic public health measures should be considered a form of climate change adaptation. And that, you know, you can really interrupt these exposure pathways that are leading to human health impacts through adaptation measures. And a lot of these are things that we already know how to do. So for example, with this complicated figure, we can have flood control that can keep the heavy rainfall events from causing flooding. Sanitation can keep from pathogens ever entering into the environment in the first place. Hygiene education, people can work, you know, through appropriate hygiene. You can keep people from ingesting the pathogens. And then there's also drinking water treatment systems and management that can keep people from ingesting the pathogens. So there's a lot of basic public health measures that can be rolled out to address these issues. And then point of use drinking water treatment. And so this is consistent with a lot of the literature in the IPCC that talks about how, you know, the most effective measures in the near term are to improve basic public health measures. And, you know, there's a lot of things that we already know how to do. So we should be, and a lot of these issues, in some ways, climate is an extra, like if you have good water sanitation systems, then climate is actually kind of going to have less of an impact than when you have these poor underlying conditions. So that kind of gets back at this concept that showed earlier. And just finally, just when we're thinking about studying these issues, how do we move towards designing interventions? Historically, we have, is this still advancing? Is this good? Okay.
It's still advancing. However, it looks like somebody is trying to take over the chat. So I just encourage everyone to ignore that, please. And let's focus on what the speaker is saying.
Thanks, Gordon. We have, you can do these long-term time series studies to understand what the historic conditions are and how they're related to what's the relationship between historic conditions and climate drivers, like a lot of the work that we've done. You can start to project that out to future conditions, taking your models of using historic data and thinking about how that might affect things in the future. And then you can, but I think it's really important to also include variables in all of your models of historic conditions about, you know, social and environmental mediators to understand how those modify these relationships, because then those are the things that you can tweak going forward, and you can start to project future conditions. And if you make certain investments, how could those reduce your vulnerability to future impacts of climate change? So that is all I have, and that's it. So thanks, and more information about my research program is here. We wait till the end to take questions, right? I've never been in a seminar where people are trying to take over, but I think that Gordon's right, just
Seems to
ignore
make
it.
sense, yeah.
Yeah, we've turned off chat because there were people that tried to take over, and we'll figure out how to do the Q&A at the end.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, Luann, should I just go?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, sounds good. All right, folks, please stay with me and ignore what's going on. And if the people who are doing this are listening to me, trust me, I've been called worse. You're not going to bug me.
No, the chat is off, so there won't be any more activity on there.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks a lot. That was great, Karen. I really appreciate your talk. That's cool. I come at some of these questions from the resource side rather than the health side. So it's a really good kind of contrast. And one of the things I think we may notice here at the end of my talk is that people like us should work together and to talk, because probably the gap in getting to solutions is that kind of collaboration. So I'm going to put in a pitch for collaboration right off the bat. Okay, so this is my talk. I'm going to focus primarily on the Mekong. That's where I do a fair amount of my research. But I start all my talks in a particular way, and this is the way I started. And I do this to try to, let's keep an eye on the big picture here, people. This is the fundamental problem that society has to deal with, right? Which is we have an increasing impact on the globe as the result of an increasing world population. That world population is becoming increasingly affluent. And there's technology associated that's changing all the time, and that technology has positive effects for the environment or negative effects for the environment. And this is what's called the IPAT equation. It was developed by two scientists in the late 60s, right? This is nothing new. But here's what we're struggling with. We've got a natural system that's getting impacted that we as people rely on. And we need to figure out how we're going to deal with that. And there's lots of aspects to this. There's biodiversity, there's disease, there's natural resources like fish. But it all comes down to this fundamental kind of issue here that there's a lot of us and we have a big impact because of how we live. And we need to figure out how we're going to deal with that. Okay, so, I see I'm not doing presenter. So that leads us to this question of what does large-scale environmental change mean for people? And I really like this perspective, and it keeps with the theme of this seminar series, which is taking a human health perspective. And what we've got here is a diagram that shows all the way on the left, we've got environmental change. So the world is changing. We're having pretty significant impacts on our environment. This is going to impact ecosystem services. So what are ecosystem services? These are all the things. They could be goods, they could be food, they could be enjoyment of nature, they could be fresh water, nutrient regulation. All these things we as humans derive from ecosystems. And those loss of ecosystem services are going to have outcomes, and in particular for this graph, outcomes in human health. Okay, but in between that is these two factors here. And one is this idea of risk, right? And this is what Karen was talking about, is the risk of human health. And some risk is not going to be shared equally to all people. Okay, that's what this is getting at. Some people are going to be at relatively high risk for human health impacts as a result of environmental change. And some people are going to be at relatively low impacts for relatively low risk for impacts of environmental change. It's not going to be shared equally. And the question is, why is that? And here, this diagram has modifying factors. And normally I would poll the class to say, hey, what do you think are these modifying factors? But I'd rather not get called names. So I'm just going to give it to you, which is, let's see, there you go, is a big one here. There's a bunch, but the one I'm going to focus on is poverty, okay? Poverty is a big determinant of whether individuals are going to be more at risk or less at risk in terms of their health as a result of environmental change. Okay, so my next pitch here is to say that this is largely going to play out in, I think, or one of the main, I won't say entirely, but one of the main areas this is going to play out is in freshwater ecosystems. Freshwater ecosystems are hugely important despite being a relatively small part of the globe. They're disproportionately important for people. They're also undergoing really rapid change. Sorry, going there. Okay, so this is a map of threats to freshwater ecosystems across the globe. And there's a couple kinds of threats. There's threats to water security, and that's over on this side, and those are kind of the gray and the brown. And then we got threats to biodiversity. That would be on this side here in these colors. And so if you got red, you've got high threat to both. If you've got yellow, you've got high threat to biodiversity, but not necessarily water security. And so one of the things that you might notice looking at this figure is that a whole bunch of the world is covered in color here, right? We have really significant threats to freshwaters across much of the world. The places where you don't have it are basically deserts here in Africa, where there's not a whole lot, in the Middle East, where there's just not a whole lot of surface water, and in the far north, right? These are the areas where we're not seeing substantial threats to freshwater. So this is just, I'm just making an argument here that this is a really, really important issue to consider. Okay, so that's establishing freshwaters are this area that's of concern with respect to environmental change, and that's going to have impacts on humans. I'm going to kind of switch and talk about fish. Why fish? I'm a fishy guy. I've always been a fishy guy. This is what I do. Since I was a little kid, I had fish in aquariums, and it's what I love. Not always the most relevant thing. And at one point, I'm going to tell a little story about how one of my colleagues in the fisheries department came in and said, "Hey, buddy, I know you like freshwater fish, but the reality is that most of the fish that are caught for human consumption, which is this lineup here, are marine fish. And in fact, freshwater fish are only like 10% of what's caught. They're not a big deal." All right. And I'm like, oh man, tuck my tail, go back to my desk, have a little cry. This is, not making me happy. But I buckled down and said, hey, well, maybe the amount of fish being caught is not really the relevant metric here. Maybe they're more important to people than you might expect. So first thing I do is I looked at some of these data on catches over time and said, hey, yeah, freshwater fish, these are all freshwater fish catches here, starting 1950, going through about 2010, I think is when this was made. And yeah, for a lot of the globe, this is small and it's not changing and it's no big deal. North America, Europe, Middle East and North Africa don't have any water except for the Nile, so forget about it, right? But then there are these areas of the globe that really do actually have significant catches, and these catches are increasing along with population growth. We're looking at East Asia and the Pacific, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia. So these are areas where there's potentially, freshwater fish are important. All right, so let's dig a little deeper here and pull this out. So again, kind of going on this idea of, well, maybe freshwater fish as something important for human health isn't really reflected in the total catch numbers. And so here's another plot. What I've got on the x-axis here is each one of these dots is a country on the globe. These are data from FAO. And the x-axis is the per capita GDP, right? So relatively low GDP countries over here on the left, relatively high GDP countries on the right. What we've got on the Y is total animal protein consumed per person per day, okay? And you can see a pretty clear trend, right? That more money that a country has, the more animal protein they're eating. This isn't actually a big surprise. We've known this for quite a while, actually. But see if I can get my slide to advance. If we rescale these dots and say, hey, what proportion of that protein, that animal protein, is coming from freshwater fish? And then there's another real clear trend here. And that is, these countries down here on the lower end of the economic scale are getting a disproportionately high amount of their protein from freshwater fish compared to other countries. So the way I like to frame this is that, often freshwater fish are kind of the protein of last resort for people. If we had a major earthquake in the Puget Sound region and everything went to hell and there wasn't a food system, I know what I'm doing. I'm grabbing my fishing pole, right? And I'm going to go out and catch fish, and that's how I'm going to get by. And that's a common strategy around the world. All right. So let me zoom in a little more and tell you a bit about a case study and make this link of fish as food, in particular freshwater fish as food, and then link it to climate and other environmental change. And so we're going to do this in the Mekong River watershed and specifically the Tonle Sap Lake. That is part of this. I'm going to go for a map. Here we go. Okay, so here's the map to introduce us where we are. So we're in this part of the world here in Southeast Asia. And this is the Mekong River, starts up in China in the Himalayas, comes through Burma, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam. And here you can see this Tonle Sap Lake. This is on a tributary to the Mekong. It's the largest lake in Southeast Asia. Zooming in a little bit here, this is the lake. And so here's the Mekong River, and this is the Mekong Delta down here. And everything is, in normal times, everything's kind of flowing this way. Water's flowing out of the lake down this little tributary here. Well, not little, it's huge, actually. Everything heads out to the South China Sea. But, when the waters flood, though, the hydrology totally changes. And this is a really important ecosystem dynamic for fish. Getting a bit ahead of myself. And I want to zoom in on Cambodia as a country here. So you can kind of see this faint black outline. This is Cambodia as a country. The Tonle Sap Lake sits entirely within Cambodia. About 16 million people, about $1,200 US annually as terms of per capita GDP. This is the currency. It's the riel is the name of the currency in Cambodia. And this here is a small scale mud carp, which is also called the riel, right? So in Cambodia, the money is directly tied to the fish, right? They're named the same thing. The money is named after the fish. They're intimately linked. Fish is a hugely important part of Cambodia life. This is pictures of some of these fisheries. If you've kind of looked around in freshwater fish stuff, you often hear about these big charismatic freshwater fish that are disappearing across the globe, which is certainly a tragedy for biodiversity. But when you're talking about feeding people, you're actually talking about small silverfish, little boring small silverfish. This is what people eat and people rely on. Okay. And I normally have a video where there's a drone that flies up this river here, but I took it out for bandwidth reasons. But I just kind of want to impress, this is a picture of the Tonle Sap River. And fishing's a big deal in this country. It's a dominant economic activity and a dominant strategy for livelihoods. And what you see here are a set of arrow traps that are on all the corners of this river. And so fish swim downstream and they run into these fences and then go down here and get caught. And then every one of these little white dots is a net here with a bunch of people tending these nets. And if you were to see the video, you would see that this extends for probably 10 miles up the river. It's just a massive amount of fishing activity in this location. It's a big deal. All right, so here's some just stats for you to kind of get an idea of what we're talking about. If you look at the total lower Mekong Basin, we're talking about greater than 60 million people. Their average consumption of freshwater fish is about 30 kilograms per day. That's the highest per capita consumption of freshwater fish globally is Cambodia. And in fact, this is probably at least half of what reality is. This is a pretty gross underestimate. There's nearly 2 million tons of fish caught per year, which is bigger than any fishery that's ever been seen on the west coast of the United States, for example. So the big sardine fisheries or any of these things that kind of west coast history, there's a lot of lore around it. None of them match in size. If we zoom in and look at just this lake, there's about a little over 1 million people. They're all involved in fishing in some way or another, either as subsistence or as commercial. About 200,000 tons of annual catch, which is comparable to a good chunk of Alaska salmon fisheries out of just one lake. So this is an incredibly productive place where it's producing a whole bunch of food that is really important for the people in this area. It's their dominant source of animal protein is from freshwater fish by a long shot. I'm gonna try this and see if it works. So this is that flood I was talking about, and it's often called the heartbeat of the Mekong. Okay, let's see if I can just zip forward here. No, I don't want to do it again. I want to go away. Advanced slide. Uh-oh, I may have gotten myself into trouble. Okay. Okay, let's see if I can advance. Okay, we'll try this. Sorry, folks. Too small a screen and too many windows. Okay, so here's another diagram of this flood that happens every year. So the lake level goes from anywhere about 1 meter depth up to about 10 meters of depth, and the area expands about 6 times. And this is just incredibly important for not only the people that live there, where there's examples of these floating villages that migrate with the shoreline. These are largely fishing villages, and they follow that shoreline as it moves in and out. It's important for the biology. There's all sorts of different forms of adaptation of animals to this flood and drought cycle. This is one, it's the walking catfish. So this one is it basically tries to hang out and it'll stay in one spot, and it's all happy when the water's in, but when the water's out, it just gets up and walks to somewhere else. It just says, okay, I'm just gonna walk over. But there's all sorts of adaptation to deal with this flooding. It is by far the dominant structuring force in this ecosystem. And it's changing, okay? And this is what we're looking at and what we're worried about. It's changing in part because of climate change, and that's this diagram here, and I won't go through all the parts, but it's essentially looking at the duration of days of flooding in different parts of that lower Mekong Basin. Here's the lake. That red spot is a permanent lake, so it's always flooded. And then there's all the way to places that are only flooded for a couple days a year. This is reference over here, and then these are various climate scenarios. And what you look for, and this is the change in duration over time from reference condition. And as a result of climate change, you would expect this flooding to be longer. That's kind of the long story short of this, is that climate change in the region is predicted to lengthen the flood season. And this is predicted to be pretty significant. However, this is not the only change that's going on in the basin, right? The other thing that's happening, that's kind of the elephant in the room, is hydropower construction. And so dams are being built throughout the basin. There's bulldozers running right as we speak, building dams. Largely, there's a little bit for water retention for agriculture, but it's largely for hydropower. The idea is that the Mekong is going to be the battery of Asia. And it's going to sell electricity throughout Southeast Asia and up into China. So if we expand that analysis and ask, well, what's the effect of hydropower relative to climate change? And this is a tough figure to get at, and I'm just going to point you down here in this lower right corner. And what this shows is that if you put the two together, you're going to have some areas that are going to have longer flood. That's this dark blue. but a lot of areas that are actually going to have shorter flood. Those dams are going to retain the water. And so despite climate change pushing for a longer flood duration, a hydropower is actually going to likely hold that water back, and it's going to end up being a net lower flood duration. So instead of the lake, if you can see me, lead of the lake going like nice, smooth, expanding and contracting over time, it's going to do this. It's going to go shorter, right? It's going to be a shorter flood. Question is, what does that mean for people and for food? And so this is our project. We're looking at these effects of climate change and hydropower on this flood pulse. That's what we call that flood dynamic, that annual flood dynamic is the flood pulse. What does it do for ecosystem function? And how does that influence fish production and the nutritional and contaminant content of fish? So we're looking at the amount of fish, but also what's the quality of that fish? And this recognizes that these fish are eating different things, and because you are what you eat, you have different nutritional content. And both of these things should be related to the flood pulse. And that's ultimately going to determine what is available to people in terms of food resources in this region. Okay, so sorry. So the first sciencey bit here is this science paper that was published, I know it's a while ago now, with some colleagues that I show you here. And this was looking at a particular fishery. This is called the dye fishery. And this is that fishery that's on the river where there's these big giant nets put in the river that are catching all the fish that are migrating out, okay? And the reason we use this particular data set is it's the longest data set we have. It goes back to 1995, and it's a pretty decent data set. And so here's a picture, oops. Here's a picture, so these are these big nets. This is the mouth up here, fish swim into it, get caught in a net, and then the fishermen use this bar to roll the fish down the net to that house that's sitting at the back, and then dump the fish on the boat and harvest them. So like I said, we've got a long data set here that we can work with, and what we're asking is, what are the aspects of the flood that are correlated with fish catches over time? And there's a few things it could be. It could be the magnitude of the flood, right? How high is the flood in any given year? If you had a high water year, do you have a high fish catch? Do you have a high water year the year before? Do you have a high fish catch? Maybe that flood came early in a particular year. Is that correlated with strong fish catches? Maybe there was a big drought in the summer before. Maybe that drought was particularly long in the summer before. Maybe the flood is particularly long. So we looked at all these metrics of the hydrology, and then we related that to the fish catch. And I'm going to just kind of give you the answer here. And fish catch is strongly related to the magnitude of the flood and the duration of the low water period. And these are all lagged by 1 year. So the year before a fish catch, if there's a big flood followed by a low followed by high highs, you get a good fish catch. Now this is important for a couple of reasons, right? One is we're understanding something about the biology of these fish. It makes sense given what we know about the ecology. But the other thing, and the reason this got in science, is because the question is, what do we do about all these hydrologic changes? And if we want to include ecosystem services, we have to have a mathematical description that describes what we want. And we developed one. We basically said, look, here's the formula, folks. If you want to maintain fishery catches in this system, you need to release water in a particular way that is low lows followed by high highs. And that's something we can take to a dam operator and say, look, let's work on an optimization scenario that meets this societal objective and balance it with other societal objectives like hydropower production and whatnot. So it's a way to kind of use the ecology of the system to try to do adaptive management. All right, I'll just breeze through this real quick in the interest of time. One of the things that we also pointed out in this is that these are those two metrics. This is flood pulse extent, so that's the magnitude. This is that duration of that low water. Both of these metrics are changing, and they're changing in the wrong direction over time. So the flood pulse extent is going down, that flood is getting smaller, And the duration of the long interval is, in this case, it's plotted backwards. I'm sorry. In any case, it's changing in the wrong direction. This, it looks like it's going up. It's actually getting shorter. I'll explain it if you really want to know. In any case, they're changing in the wrong direction. These breakpoints here, when they change, are associated with 2 dams that were put into tributaries in Thailand. So it's the dams that are creating this change. Okay, so that's the fish production side, right? We've related flood pulse. We've done some ecology work to try to figure out the mechanisms, but largely we've shown that we can, the timing and the magnitude of the flood pulse is related to fish production, and we've got a potential objective here. What about the nutritional, the quality side of this? So that's here, and this again is, you are what you eat, right? And when you're a fish, you eat a lot of things. You're kind of a garbage can with mouths. That's what they are, right? They eat a whole bunch of stuff, and they eat, the things that I want you to focus on are these things right here. And there's 2 bacterial pathways and 1 algal pathway. And what we have found is the reason this lake produces so much fish is that all 3 of these ways of getting energy or food up to fish are pretty strong. So we normally just think about this algae use light and carbon dioxide, you grow an algae, some zooplankton chews on the algae, some fish eats the zooplankton. In this system, this bacterial pathway is really important. And then there's a second bacterial that's actually based on methane, and it's analogous to a hydrothermal vent you would see in the bottom of the ocean. Is also an important pathway of getting energy. And it's the fact that all of these are working is why this system makes so much fish. It also means these fish are not equally valuable. Well, I won't say valuable. They're not equal in terms of their nutritional content. And oops, there we go. This is the figure I want to show. So this is fatty acid data, right? And so these are fats in different species of fish. And there's really significant differences. This is a non-dimensional scaling plot. So it just shows the relative difference, and you just look at the clustering. And what it's saying here is there's a group of fish that have high fatty acid content proportionally that is related to bacterial sources, and then saturated fats, which are also generally, bacteria have a lot of saturated fats in their lipid profile. There's a group of fishes that have a lot of these methane oxidizing bacteria. So they have kind of a different fat profile based on what they eat. And then there's a third group of fish over here that have a fat profile related to algae. And these are the ones that are high in omega-3s and omega-6s and have all the fats that we kind of think of as like, oh, this is why you eat fish, right? You eat salmon to get those good omega-3 fatty acids. Well, that's these fish up here, but these things look more like a stick of butter than they do salmon, right? They're not all the same. And in fact, what we're showing is that the effect of change will be different on these different groups, and that's going to influence kind of the availability of these, in this case, fat, that resource for people. If we're trying to maximize, these high quality omega-3, omega-6 lipids, it's not all the fish are the same, and it's kind of these we're targeting here as opposed to these. Okay, so I just got a couple more. One of the things we show here, so this is looking at the amount of algae produced in the lake through a normal season. And it's predicting the net primary productivity. So you can think of this as the amount of that algae that is being produced, which is also what has those good fats in it, right? Those high quality lipids. Under current baseline scenario, we have most of our production in this kind of July through August, September, October period. But under hydropower, we're going to see that go down. And then if you have hydropower plus climate change, it's largely the same. We're going to see this algal source of carbon declining as a result of all these changes. And that's the good stuff, right? And it's going to affect some of these fish species while not affecting others. Okay, so what I'm getting at here is that what's really important is this timing of the flood that's what's going to be changing, both because of climate change, but also because of this hydropower and this damming effect. And as that timing shifts, it's going to shift around not only the amount of fish, but what's available for those fish in terms of food, and then ultimately what those fish are like in terms of a food resource for others. All right, and so the last thing I just want to mention is, I'm a fishy person. That's what I like to do, but there's a lot of other complementary studies that are worth mentioning that kind of go along with this same idea of these hydrologic changes driving changes in the food system. And a really important one is arsenic from groundwater. So what's happening here is that there's an increased amount of pumping of groundwater to flood rice fields to grow more rice in the region. And that pumping is coming out of groundwater, and that groundwater is contaminated by arsenic. Reason people are pumping more is twofold. They want to make more rice just from an economic expansion perspective, but also because the flood dynamic is changing and there's not as much water there to capture as used to be there. So usually it used to be capturing surface water to grow the rice, but that water is no longer coming in as strong. So they're supplementing by pumping groundwater. And that groundwater is high in arsenic, and that arsenic gets in the rice and ultimately to the people. And this causes arsenosis with a whole bunch of negative health effects that are listed here. So, and I could go on, there's a few more examples about kind of how this human health, be it food availability or maybe exposure to arsenic and other contaminants like mercury, or exposure to disease. I'm sure there's relationships there. How this water is moving around is related to all of that. And it's what we are thinking about and working on. So some parting thoughts here. Environmental change is not going to affect everybody equally. We have to think about the inequities that are going to happen as our world changes. Freshwater fish, not just cute for fish tanks. They're a really important resource for people. And then again, this idea that the amount and the timing of water is really critical here. And these are what's going to be, both those aspects are going to be changing as we go forward. And so that is what I had. And
Thank you. Thank you, Karen and Gordon. That was really great.